Anthony Bergen's my name. I'm the Deputy Director at ASPI, and it's been my privilege to be associated with the Aus Africa Dialogue since its inception, and delighted to see that there's interest in our findings and what we're doing here tonight. I think it would be unfortunate if we had a single-minded focus on the rivers of gold in China and elsewhere in Asia if it resulted in Australia neglecting Africa. I think Africa is now moving towards prosperity, even though it's been hit, as we all know, with a significant slump in commodity prices in recent years. But in our view here, we don't think we're giving Africa the attention it deserves, and that's why my institute teamed with the Brenthurst Foundation in South Africa last September, where we met on the banks of the Zambezi River in Zambia to convene the second Australian-Africa Dialogue. Here I'd like to acknowledge the generous support that we got from our sponsors, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Foreign Affairs, the Defence Department, and indeed South African Airways. Our groups were represented by a wide range of representatives from business, from military, from the diplomatic community, and the law enforcement community, along with intelligence professionals. I'm delighted that a number of the Australian delegates are here tonight. David Irvin I've seen, Tony George, a number of people. Ben Gargett has come from Perth, as Trish O'Reilly, to be with us tonight, and I think that testifies to the enthusiasm of those people for Australia engaging with the African continent. I think it's good that Trish O'Reilly is here tonight from the Australian Africa Mining Group, because I have to say I think the extractive sector have really led the way in engaging the continent and getting away from Australia trying to see Africa through the developmental lens prism. I think we've gradually started to enhance our diplomatic footprint in Africa, but I think we've still, as I say, overlooked Africa's significance. And I think really the driver, I suppose, for our dialogue with the Brenthurst Foundation is to try and put Australian-African relations much more at centre stage. We think the strategic stocks of Africa are rising, and that Africa wants to be a global player, and Australia has a significant contribution to make. I would like to, before looking at a short video from the deputy of our partner institution from South Africa, I'd just like to acknowledge Lisa Charland's work in preparing this report with Terence McNamee from the Brenthurst Foundation. She did a fantastic job. I'd also like to acknowledge Layla Jack, who's not here, from the Brenthurst Foundation, for her great work in supporting our meeting last year. And as I say, you'll hear from a distinguished panel in a minute. So without further ado, if I could ask Jerry to, if we could have a look at Terence McNamee, who's the Deputy Director of the Brenthurst Foundation in Johannesburg, and who teamed with us very closely on the dialogue.
Good evening from Johannesburg. My name is Terence McNamee. I'm the Deputy Director of the Brenthurst Foundation in South Africa. On behalf of the Foundation and President Obasanjo, our chairman, let me first thank our much valued partners, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, not just for organizing the launch of our joint report this evening, but also for demonstrating such important thought leadership on African issues from the Australian perspective, and for continually highlighting the importance of African issues, not just to global commerce, security, and politics, but also increasingly to Australia's own global interests in areas as diverse as mining and education, as well as our growing mutual concerns over countering violent extremism and halting radicalization within our respective youth populations. The Aus Africa Dialogue is still young. It was an idea that was given tangible expression only a few years ago, though I'm sure that it is something Old Africa hands in the Australian Diplomatic Corps have probably been thinking about for some time. Africa and Australia share some historical experiences, but in the main, we are two continents that are still discovering one another, two continents that are at different stages of economic development, but also in our respective engagements with the global economy, in our engagements with the institutions that manage global security and finance. It also goes without saying that one can generalize only so far when we are discussing a continent of one country on the one hand and a continent of 54 countries on the other, each with their own national priorities, their own national interests. But I think in one important respect, we can generalize, and that is from a nation building perspective, African countries are still in their infancy when you think about how recently most achieved their independence. And that's important because part of what we see today in terms of levels of political volatility across the continent, in terms of our challenges and struggles around building social cohesion, around consolidating the continent's democratic advances in the past 2 decades. From a global historical perspective, this is not out of the ordinary. Societies everywhere, including Australia, have taken many, many decades, even centuries, often with many setbacks along the way, to overcome their gravest internal challenges and build states that can truly call themselves nations. Now, none of this is to underplay the serious shortcomings of some African governments which have failed to invest in their own institutions, failed to invest in their own people, and build the kind of equitable development, not just for the elite, but for all of their people. At the same time, the 21st century could really be Africa's century. Now, I know that's a cliche to say so, but if you think about the sheer numbers, if you think about how rapidly Africa is growing in terms of its youth population, in terms of urbanization, if you think about how resource rich the continent is, and if you think about how deeply new technologies are being woven into the fabric of ordinary African lives, within those mega trends lies tremendous potential to catalyze the kind of development that Africa has so desperately needed. Now, to realize that potential, it's first and foremost up to Africans themselves. But there also is a key role for strategic partners. And one of my main takeaways from the first 2 Aus Africa dialogues, the first in Bunker Bay in Western Australia, and the second last year on the banks of the Zambezi, is that there is a tremendous appetite on the African side to share experiences and learnings with Australia. Of course, Africa is not set to abandon key partners in Europe or the United States or China in the same way that Australia isn't either. But what I sense in terms of both continents is a tremendous desire to deepen linkages across the Indian Ocean, to strengthen these nascent partnerships. And from the African perspective, there is much to gain because Australia provides not only more realistic analogs for Africa, but also in terms of concrete partnerships on a more equal basis than Africa has experienced in the past. Thank you.
So it's now my pleasure to introduce our 4 panellists tonight, each of whom I've asked to speak crisply for about 6 to 8 minutes, please no more, so we can finish on time. So I will introduce them in the order that they'll speak. I won't be bobbing up 4 times. So the first speaker is the Kenyan High Commissioner, His Excellency Isaiah Kibera. The Ambassador is a former print and TV journalist. He spent over a decade as the press secretary to a former Kenyan President, Mwai Kibaki, and he's had a very distinguished diplomatic career, which I won't go through tonight, but very impressive resume. Now, I'm going to spend more than 10 seconds on introducing our next speaker, Thomas Nerissa Tamala, who specifically travelled here to join us tonight from South Africa. Now, if I have pronounced Thomas's last name incorrectly, please forgive me. I've done my Google research and I found that, as far as I can tell, Thomas is the only person in the world with that last name. But I should be able to pronounce it because we first met in 2012, I think it was, Thomas, and we've worked together on a range of Australian African issues since then, and truly he's someone I'm very proud now to call a friend. In recent years, Thomas has been based in South Africa. He's built up tremendous expertise working in the extractive sector. He's established and run mines in places as diverse as Rwanda, Mauritania, and in his home country, the DRC. Before becoming a businessman, an associate of the Brenthurst Foundation, Thomas was a politician. Most notably, he was the Deputy Governor of South Kivu Province in the DRC. As we all know, that's a very troubled part of the world. And I think Thomas has seen more conflict and difficult circumstances than any of us in this room can imagine. The one thing I do know about him, over many drinks and discussions, that he's as passionate as anyone I've ever met about Africa realising its potential, especially improving governance across the continent. But don't take my words about Thomas for my fine words about him. Let me read to you something that someone else said. Someone very famous wrote about Thomas 10 years ago in the Daily Telegraph in Britain. This is a direct quote. "It was the strangest journey of my life, and it always will be. I was looking for fictional characters I'd invented in a country I'd never visited. The distant town of my imagination was Bukavu in the eastern Congo, built in the early 20th century by the Belgian colonialists. But when I met Thomas there, he's about as far removed from my expectation as he could decently be. He's tall, he's elegantly dressed, as tonight, and receives us with diplomatic grace. His house, guarded by sentries with semi-automatic rifles, is spacious. Plasma TV screen plays silent football while we talk. He speaks for the Banyamulenge, I'm sorry, Thomas, and his people who have been fighting wars in the Congo pretty well non-stop since 1966. Now, can anyone actually guess who wrote this? Well, it was none other than the famous spy writer, thriller writer, John le Carre. So welcome, Thomas, welcome. Finally, Lisa Charland, who, as I say, did so much work to get the dialogue underway and prepared our report. Lisa's a senior analyst here who works on UN peace operations, issues to do with women and security and broader Australian-African relations. She's recently returned from field work in South Sudan and the Central African Republic as part of a visiting fellowship with the Stimson Centre in Washington. So great that Lisa is here now. So that's the introductions. Ladies and gentlemen, you have your 6 to 8 minutes and invite the Ambassador. You can either speak from there or come to the lectern. It's up to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Anthony. Let me first acknowledge the Gunawal people, the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Let me also recognize the presence of my fellow High Commissioners, Mercy from Ghana, High Commissioner of Ghana, and George, High Commissioner of Zambia, where the report was done. Thank you so much for your presence here today. To Your Excellency Ambassador Maggie Newhouse, Mr. Thomas Nziratimana of Trans Africa Resources, Lisa Charland, and all you distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me to the launch of the Australia-Africa 2015 Dialogue Report. Congratulations to Lisa and Terence and the team for compiling this report. I'm glad to be here to share some of my thoughts. Last year, Australia marked 50 years since its diplomatic footprint in Kenya. We also marked 30 years since Kenya opened its High Commission in Canberra. The 50-30 deadline is a clear pointer of our two nations' commitment to long-term and mutually beneficial relations. Last week, we celebrated Africa Day and reminded ourselves of the vision of our continent's founding fathers when they gathered to establish the Organization of African Unity, the forebearer of the African Union. On that day, in 1963, as they penned their signatures to the OAU Charter, they stated that they were conscious of their responsibility to harness the natural and human resources of our continent for the total achievement of our peoples in all spheres of human endeavors. On account of developing human resources, much progress has been achieved. In 1963, Australian professionals were to be found in Kenya and in many parts of Africa. Since my arrival in Canberra, I have met people like 85-year-old Mrs. Maureen Hickman, who worked with the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation as a young producer in the early 1960s. Mr. Richard Dodson, who in the 1950s worked in Kenya's Department of Geology and Mines, helping to map out the mineral riches of my country. Then, there were hardly any Africans working in Australia. Today, African professionals are to be found in Australia's hospitals, working as doctors, as nurses, as mining engineers in Western Australia, or teachers and professors in schools and universities across this vast continent. On the other hand, we have a different Australia to Africa movement. 200 Australian companies have invested over $40 billion in 700 projects in their extractive sector around Africa. They have laid claim to Africa's vast riches that account for 30% of the world's natural resources. Africa's founding fathers envisioned that our natural resources should work for our people. Those charged with the responsibility of extracting these resources, and I'm happy to see Trish here, should be conscious of that responsibility. I commend the Australian companies that have invested in our continent. There is much that can be done. The extraction of Africa's resources can create win-win situations, as stated in the report. Natural resources need not be seen as hot points of conflict, but points of opportunity. Australia's foreign policy has been guided by the Pacific region leaning position. We appreciate the need for Australia to take care of your neighbors, but when your private citizens invest $40 billion in Africa, just in one sector, maybe it's time for a policy shift. Australia and Africa can work closely to build capacity in Africa so that many decades after the Australian companies have exploited the resources, there will be a positive story to tell of an empowered people who are better skilled in their chosen vocation because of the presence of Australian investment and expertise. Australian firms can work with African governments to reduce the gaping holes that have so many times been the hallmark of mining. I want to commend the government of Australia for establishing the Advisory Group for Australia-Africa Relations. Kenya and Africa welcomes their proposal to have the Africa Week in Perth in September this year. This is a week that will help drive a positive Africa narrative as we deliberate on mining, oil, gas, education. And I welcome the recommendations that the report we are launching today talks about the need for Africa to project its power, influence, and opportunity. This is a truthful narrative because in 2050, Africa will have a population of 2.2 billion people. Out of this, the middle class alone will be 1 billion people. Just as Australia made a strategic move to embrace China in 1973 and became one of the biggest beneficiaries of the economic growth that China has witnessed in the last 25 years, this is the time to plan for Africa of tomorrow. This is the time for the new dialogue that is proposed by this report. I look at myself as an Afro-optimist. The challenges of Africa today are the opportunities of tomorrow. African youth have embraced ICT. We are investing in clean energy to power our villages, building roads and railways to connect our people. Just next week, a delegation from Kenya will be visiting Australia to undertake a due diligence on an Australian company that has been shortlisted to manage Kenya's standard gauge railway line. This is a new $4 billion investment that promises to revolutionize our region's transport sector. Today, the biggest investor in our mining sector is Base Resources, a $400 million investment. This is an Australian firm that helped unlock the potential of titanium mining in Kenya after 15 years of hits and misses. Yes, it is possible to have trade and investments. I also concur with the report that there's need for more trade and investment and not just aid. We are ready to work with Australia to create more business-to-business partnerships with members of the private sector, as highly recommended by this report. Let us create partnerships that help African enterprises to be enabled as local service providers. As we do this, we must stop and work with members of our diaspora who are also keen to be entrepreneurs. What works in Australia also works in Africa. It is also my wish that we can have an African Institute that will help in the coordination of Africa events and voices in Australia. The voice of African governments and the African diaspora will be best vocalized under a coordinated approach that overrides our individual and national interests. As Africa's population grows, we are turning to the oceans to tap more resources. I welcome the report's practical proposals in tapping into the blue economy. This is especially critical as we bring more of our youth and women into the modern economy and stem extremism. For example, creating partnerships between mothers and children to tap into the Indian Ocean. While the young men can be empowered to undertake deep sea fishing, their mothers can be great marketers of this product and creating strong partnership. If we are to empower women, as the report recommends, agriculture is key. Australia is a success story in dryland farming, and getting Africa to apply some of the Australian smart technology would both empower women and fight poverty. Empowering our women and youth will be a powerful fight as we fight against extremism. Yes, terrorism is a challenge of our time, and I know this report highlights a lot of issues about security. It is a fight for the heart and soul of the youth. This is not a religious war. No one is immune to this vice. It is a war that is being fought in cyberspace, and more good people must stand up to use their valuable time on social media to tell the story of good versus bad, not them versus us. The world must create a critical mass against terrorism, and not the occasional anger that implodes whenever we have an incident. Nations must stop seeing acts of terrorism as isolated marks of weaknesses in certain national jurisdictions, but an act against modern civilization. Kenya remains a regional bulwark against terrorism and extremism. AMISOM forces from the African Union, including Kenya's defense forces, have helped to liberate many parts of Somalia. We are saying this is the time for the people of Somalia to start the process of reconstruction of Somalia. Somalia was the first point where we saw incidences and the growth of terrorism, and the world watched as we created open and governed spaces that have led to the growth in this extremism. And I think Somalia continues to be a good example of how we must not deal with terrorism. And we stand as a country to work with Australia and to stem this tide. Finally, thank you for your time. I wish to recommend this report to most of my colleagues here. Thank you very much.
Anthony and the entire team of ASPI for inviting us here to Australia once again. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed, I'd like to welcome you together with the a friend of ASPI as the Brentest Foundation to the launch of this report. A guest was welcoming the host. I will apologize first of all if my accent is not Australian-like or English-like. It's not because I was a bad student or I jumped classes. It's because I speak French mainly. I'm truly honored to be here in Canberra to represent the Brentest Foundation, an organization where I am an associate. Terry McNamee, who spoke earlier on, is a deputy director, and it is hard to speak after the deputy director. I'll try and bring my own perspective of this forum and dialogue. It is wonderful to have friends here in Australia. Anthony and Lisa and Peter was not here. Since the inception of this forum, you have really been amazing in terms of commitment and focus to get us somewhere. And it looks like we are slowly heading somewhere. I came to Australia in 2012 to represent the Brentest Foundation in the early discussion that we've had. And since then, so much has happened. When we started, the question was, what will be the scope of this relation between Australia and Africa when we have 54 countries and one country? I was reminded that Australia is not a country, it's a continent, so it's an equivalent continent to Africa. Africa is indeed diverse, and each country has its own reality, but we also have a lot of commonalities as African. The African story can be understood in a simple example of Congo, which is a country with immense opportunity, but also immense challenges. Just to touch on Congo, Congo has 70 million people. It has an impressive potential in the mining sector, evaluated to be around $24 trillion worth. The hydro potential of Congo could literally lead the entire Africa, yet that Africa is still in the dark, literally. But it has not reached its potential because of poor governance. The country remains one of the poorest. So the question is, how can we have such immense opportunity but not turn them into concrete realities? And it helps to have friends like Australia, because you provide an excellent example of a resource-rich country which has managed to transform or to utilize the resources you have and build a world-class infrastructure. In the past, there were a lot of skepticism about Africa, but we think this dialogue is an opportunity that we need to seize, because Africa is opening up. Africa is becoming much more democratic. There are many countries that have shown a lot of progress, although there are few others who are still in this, whose president still wants to extend their term beyond the two that are in their constitution. Just to give an example of Zambia, the ambassador was here. I was talking to two Zambian friends recently at two different occasions. I said, who's going to win the election? Now, it's very difficult to predict election. Two of them said, and I hope ambassador won't be angry at me, they say opposition. And it's very good to see that people can believe that a non-sitting party can unseat the government of the day, and yet the incumbent is still running. So it shows really, it's an example that Africa is heading somewhere. Not that I wish that the opposition should win, Ambassador, but it just shows that there is, the democracy is growing, the democracy project in Africa is growing in many places. Another reason to be optimistic is the critical mass of young Africans. We have got, I think it's in 2030, 1 in 4 young men in the world will be African. And if you look at the level of education that has been happening, the advance in technology in many places with a cell phone, you have a critical mass of young Africans that would demand only the best. There's a return of diaspora. There's a lot of dynamism in entrepreneurship in Africa. Africa is getting connected, not entirely. A lot of work still needs to be done in terms of infrastructure. But when you look at East Africa, currently East Africa is linking the entire region through railway. You've just spoken about it. So much work is happening to integrate sub-regional organizations like ECOWAS and the East African Community. All this really tells us the story, or the story of Africa Rising is a correct narrative, and that we need to take note of that. So the question is, why do we need this dialogue between Australia and Africa? It's because of shared interest. Without shared interest, we cannot really do much. Only where people feel like they are beneficial, they are mutually benefiting from the relation, can this relation grow. And this dialogue, and I believe with the help of ASPI, will help us to get to know each other much more. And from the time we started, Anthony, so much has happened, and we feel like we are much more closer than we were before. We thought of Australia as a really faraway place that at the end of the world, literally, but it's closer than we could imagine. It's just the hearts of people that were not connecting, and there was not such opportunity to do that. So more and more we feel, and we can feel Australia from where we are. Australia has an advantage, unlike many first world economies, because it has not been involved in colonial past in Africa. So the people are at ease to interact with Australian without really having any thought of a hidden agenda somewhere. And that is an advantage that needs to be utilized, because there is such openness, and Australians have shown that they've got quality technicians. I mean, if you look at the mining sector, amazing executives that are coming on the continent with so much knowledge that could be shared, between the two continents. The way Australia utilizes its resources, it's an example that we need to learn. The standard of your security and defense people, with the growing threat of terrorism on the continent, something that we were not accustomed to, although we had our own wars and issues. This needs a better understanding of how to handle these the issues that are arising as a result of terrorism. The quality of your education here in Australia is very impressive. In the last dialogue, we had a presentation on Australia education system. It is something to emulate and to learn from. So there are many commonalities, and we believe point that needs this dialogue to take care of and to push and to move forward. This work that has been started by ASPI and the Brenters Foundation is something that will require support from all stakeholders. And I believe the way, the path on which we are is promising. I am always impressed by the quality of people that ASPI has brought into these discussions. The level of understanding of the issues and the practical solution that they've offered gives me hope that if this engagement carries on, we will truly see a new chapter starting between Africa and Australia. And thank you for all you have done. And I would like to commend once again the work of ASPI in bringing us together and fostering this forum. Thank you. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'll keep my comments very brief, keeping an eye on the time so that we have a little bit of time for discussion with some of the very distinguished panellists who have already spoken this evening. But there are a couple of things that I wanted to comment on from the dialogue. And I was sitting here on the panel thinking about my first introduction to travelling in Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, my first trip took me to the DRC and to Kenya. And it was an incredible insight, I think, into the diversity the challenges and also the opportunities on the continent, and what they meant in terms of Australia's engagement. So to have the opportunity to go back with the dialogue and with Aspie and Brenthurst and others was a fantastic insight into a much broader discussion about the continent. There are a couple of things I wanted to touch upon. One of the areas, and Matthew has alluded to this, I think, was the dialogue was occurring at a particularly interesting time, I think, in terms of Australia's engagement in Africa. Having just come off the UN Security Council, where a large part of the agenda has been focused on African issues, I think has provided quite a bit of insight to the Australian government. And there's also, I think, a real opportunity there to seize on that and take it forward. And I think having a consistent approach to that going forward is particularly important. There were two issues of discussion at the dialogue that I think are interesting to highlight among the many that were discussed, but I think because we haven't touched upon these in depth. One that has been referred to was the discussion we had around women, peace and security. And there was a really dynamic group of women engaged in the discussions that took place in the dialogue that really, I think, added and enriched the experiences and the issues that we were talking about. It was particularly timely, given that last year, 2015, was the 15th anniversary of the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. But it was also, the African Union had also declared that year the Year of Women's Empowerment and Development towards Africa's Agenda 2063. So it was quite timely to be having that discussion. And I think we had a panel there that had a number of women who had experience in Parliament, serving as ministers, talking about broader issues, I think, on this agenda. And I think it was one way and one area where the dialogue contributes in terms of fostering those people-to-people links and exchanging those different viewpoints and experiences. So that was particularly relevant in the context of our discussions. I think an issue that was also highlighted throughout the dialogue, and Thomas referred to this, was the importance of youth and engaging youth. And in fact, in December, after the dialogue had taken place, although I don't think by any means it was of direct relation to the dialogue, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution, its first ever one, on youth, peace and security. And I think in Africa's context, the importance of engaging that demographic is incredibly important. And one of the recommendations that came out of the dialogue, that we should be looking at ways to foster engagement between youth, both in Australia and Africa, and how we can do that, I think, a little bit better. The second issue was looking at some of the issues on defence and security. And a large focus of these discussions was, we also talked about terrorism, but also looking at UN peace operations. For those that may not be aware, about 80% of the UN's engagement in UN peacekeeping, 80% of the personnel deployed are deployed to Africa, so it's quite a significant focus there. And in fact, Australia has a very long history of engagement in that area, currently having ADF personnel deployed in South Sudan, and there's also an AFP officer who's the police commissioner in Liberia at the moment. So I think there's an important discussion there about ongoing engagement and opportunities in that particular area. One other issue that was raised had to do with counter-improvised explosive devices and the experiences that Australia has gained coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq in those contexts. And when you look at some of the challenges that are being faced in places such as Mali, I know Kenya's also had experiences in terms of some of the impact of terrorism. I think, again, this was something that was highlighted as an area for ongoing engagement and sharing of lessons. And that's just a snapshot, I think, of many of the areas that don't require an extensive array of engagement, but that there are strategic opportunities for Australia to be talking with a lot of countries in Africa about where we can be engaging. One of the other issues that was brought up in that context was also discussions around some of the work that Australia's been doing in the civil-military space. And I know we've got Alan Ryan here from the Australian Civil Military Centre tonight. Australia's got a history of engagement on issues such as protection of civilians with the African Union. But a lot of that work has not been taken forward in the last few years, and I think there's a real opportunity there to see where we could be engaging, particularly with the African Union, on some of these security issues, given the role it is playing within Africa at the moment. So effectively, I think I'll wrap up in a moment so we can open the floor to discussion, but really for me, sort of looking back on the dialogue, it was a question of what are sort of Australia's interests and looking through the Australian lens in terms of engaging with Africa. Geographically, we've got sort of looking at the Indian Ocean and to the west, and there is quite a large geographic focus, as anyone sort of working particularly or looking at the current Defence White Paper would know that we're quite geographically focused in our own region. But I think looking at sort of what that means in terms of an Indian Ocean perspective is important. But But I think also in terms of the rules-based global order, which again was another term that came out of our recent Defence White Paper, and sort of looking at Australia's interest as something not just tied to geography. What does it mean in terms of Australians who are working in Africa? Matthew talked about some of the consular responses that are required when Australians are involved in unfortunate incidents. What does that mean? What does it mean in terms of economics and the private sector investment, our mining industry, energy sectors who are engaged? What does that mean in terms of Australia's interest and engagement? What does it mean in terms of threats, whether it be pandemics or state fragility or terrorism, in terms of engaging? And what does it mean more in terms of being the global international citizen beyond our borders? So I think there's a broad array of interests that were brought up during the dialogue, and I think there's a lot of engagement that can continue there. And it's a case of looking at sort of what Australia's strategic engagement in some of these areas should be going forward. So the dialogue has, I think, provided a useful platform for a lot of that engagement, and one that we certainly are interested from the ASPI's perspective in continuing going forward. And we look forward to engaging with our friends and colleagues, I think, in that discussion going forward in the future. So on that note, I will open the floor to questions.